Call the meeting to order. It is 10:03.
You have to do your job.
All right, I'll start with roll call. So I'm going to roll call this, though we're going to have to chat about this a little bit later. But Chair Rocha has resigned effectively today. So he will not be running the meeting today. Vice Chair Kennedy, who is now Chair Kennedy, will be running the meeting today. So Chair Kennedy?
I guess that means I accept the nomination.
I think it's a voluntold situation. Yeah. All right, you're here. Member Fan?
Here.
Member Goodman?
Here.
Member Kraxberger is excused. Member Teeters?
Here.
Member Urias?
Here.
All right.
Okay, thanks, Amber. So we'll go right into the discussion and action items. Approval of our minutes from the December 4th Workforce Housing Committee meeting.
So moved.
Can we get a second? Do we need to move this to a future meeting to approve?
What do we do, legal, if we don't have a second for the minutes?
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Approving the minutes is an administrative action, whether you were here or not. Anyone can second that. So you don't have to abstain.
I'll second then.
All right, motion carries.
All right. Sorry, we got to vote. Any nays? All ayes? All right. All right. So now we're going to go into discussing the workforce housing policy. So IT, if you could switch over to the Canva. I have some comments from Luther. I know a couple of you have your own red lines. As we go through it, I'll make notes of edits you'd like to make. I'd like to, because we're going to be on a somewhat tight schedule, for us to focus on the concepts more so than the actual wording for now. You can always email me specific wording, and I'll take all of the edits, bring them back to the March, where we will hopefully have a final draft for recommended approval. I would like to have it in a state of recommendation for approval by March. We could go to April if we needed to, but we want to make sure council has as much time as possible to really read through this before the May study session. So I'll go through it. Stop me if you have any edits, and I'll look through Luther's as we go through too. Okay. So on this one, we did, perfect. We did add expanded footprint under revitalization, infill, and expanded footprint. Nothing changed on that one. We did update the numbers. And I also put in the policy a little citation of where we got the data so that if anybody wanted to go look for themselves, they could. Nothing changed on that one. That one. Updated numbers. This one we talked about in November that we wanted it more, or that the committee wanted it more strict. So we took out that caters to and just put for the eligible workforce because it cleared up that verbiage. And I think that's where we left off. So.
Amber, I'm working from this. Is that not what you're working from? Because I'm not. I'm on
So-
page 4.
It's the same thing, just in an easier format for the public to view. So if you go through it, it's in the exact same sections, but we just tried to put it bigger so the public could see it as well.
Well, I had a comment on section 1, page 4 in this.
Okay. So what section was that? In introduction?
No, it's further down. It says workforce includes employed in occupations vital to the community, such as teachers, nurses. I just wanted to include small business in there. That's what I always say, you know.
So this section we can definitely add to, but this was the approved community outreach section that council had approved. So that's why we hadn't made any serious edits to it, but we can make edits to that as it is with the policy because council will review it.
On that topic, Amber, I would like to suggest that perhaps we simplify the language altogether. Instead of calling out very specific professions, I feel like it goes back to that era of, during COVID where we were like, oh, essential workers. Well, really, when you think about it, anyone that fits the income demographics is who we're targeting. So it's the workforce that meets that demographic criteria, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. On page 7, we do it again. We say healthcare, education, public safety, construction, other key. I agree with what you're saying.
Okay, so I'll go through in those sections and just simplify it to the workforce because we already put in a definition for what the committee considers the workforce. So we can take out all the extra.
Randy, are you looking at eligible employees on page 7? Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah. Workforce.
Yeah, so as I'm reading, it does show retail and service industry workers, construction and skilled trades. It expounds that earlier definition.
Mike, can you use your microphone?
Yeah, I thought I was. Okay. How's that? Thanks.
You know, Mike, what I see it down here further, yeah, but the thing of it is, you know how people are, they're going to read the top line of something, and then they're going to go, I don't agree with that, and move on. And that's what concerned me when I read it. When you get more in the meat and potato, it does mention the things I'm saying, but not in that sort of the headliner for it. So I don't want to turn people off right away. I want them to be all inclusive, I guess.
Okay.
So do you guys agree that simplifying the language to just workforce and defining it with the income demographics is enough?
It mitigates liability too because you're not under the radar under the microscope for accusations that you're favoritizing specific demographics such as cops, teachers, firefighters. By calling it essential workers, that really broadens the scope of what you can include there. So it falls more under the lines of HUD and equal housing lending and no discrimination as well.
And I would suggest we just drop the word essential, just say workforce.
I don't think any
I
of the
second what she just said.
no motions yet. Yeah, so I'll make any edits and I'll bring you back a draft, but I can definitely simplify all of that. All right, on to, so incentive programs, part of this is, okay. Did anybody have anything about developer qualifications? I think I just went right over those.
Wait, hang on. I did make a note to myself, and now I don't remember why. A minimum of 25% of the units dedicated to workforce housing. Why did I circle that? Is that too handcuffing, guys? 25%? Is that what we agreed on?
Well, I think we've got to get into a pretty robust conversation about what the incentives are and what the sliding scale looks like. Right, and I noticed that there's not consistency in the language. Some of them say starting at 20%. So we need to get on, I think we just need to unpack that all together as a committee, what that looks like. So do we do that now, or do you guys want to keep going in order of the document and wait till we get to that specific area on incentives?
So some of it we're going to have staff review. So I'd like to go through it and see what concepts you guys actually want to keep. And then staff can go through and put in, okay, this percentage would be appropriate or consistent with other jurisdictions. And they can put in a lot of that information, but they don't want to go dive into it if you guys are like, oh yeah, we actually hate that concept and we don't want to use that part at all, or we really love that, would like this more robust. So at this point, it's kind of getting feedback on what you guys want to cut, what you want to keep, and then we can get into the details of the sections that we keep.
Well, yeah, because the way I look at it is if we get one workforce house out of a development, we got one. To lay 25% on a developer may make his project not work, is all I'm thinking. So maybe the reward system for doing workforce housing, the more you do, the bigger the reward from us being the city, right? And the lesser the reward, but we get workforce no matter what. I don't know, I'm just putting it out there. It just bothered me when I saw that as a developer. I'm thinking, really? A quarter of what I'm gonna build? Could be problematic.
So we can definitely cut that out, and it's something, there is a section for like fees eligibility list that we'll get to, that might be where you put in, okay, if they have this percentage, we do this, and things like that. So we can take the percentage out of that initial just developer qualification section and get into that deeper later.
So Amber, for us, it's page 7, but it is under section 1B eligibility. I would suggest where we're talking about the income limitations for the eligible workforce, that we recreate that chart that Gorman has used in their LIHTC booklet. I think it's really clear because it shows a breakdown, whether you're a single, whether you're a couple, whether you're a family of 4, and where that 60 to 120% falls. I know that would have to be updated every year, but I do think it's a really valuable, clear visual tool.
Easy enough?
I have another item under this section under residency requirements. I question maybe the why, and I also wonder if we can just simplify it instead of where they reside. I mean, obviously they're trying to reside here, so that could be a gray area, but I think if we just say simply that they're employed full time, and perhaps do we want to say Yavapai County, because we are trying to, I mean, for one, we acknowledge it's a regional issue, and to be good partners with our neighbors outside of Prescott.
One of the other things, if they move into a workforce housing development, it's going to be in Prescott. They will reside in Prescott, right? Later, if they qualify. So I agree with what you just said.
Perfect, that's easy. And I will say, I'm not attached to any of this, so dissect away and I will change anything you want it to be, because it needs to be what you guys are comfortable recommending. So I'm not attached to anything.
I do have a question under the developer qualifications that follows. The very last bullet point there says developers must demonstrate financial stability, relevant project experience, and a commitment to providing housing that meets the design standards and affordability requirements outlined by the city of Prescott. I'm just curious what that enforceability looks like, and do we really want to get into the weeds in that area?
I can remove it. I don't know on the enforceability. That's one of those things that would be up to like community development, but I imagine that would take some extra work above probably what they do currently. So we could remove that and just have them go with the standards that they currently do.
Unless, Chelsea, did you want to comment on that? Just didn't want to make any assumptions.
Yeah, and I think the feedback that we as staff need is what you want to keep and investigate, so that we can look at the whole thing at the same time and bring feedback back to the committee before it goes to council. So there were a couple of things that Amber and I were discussing, like the proposed fee schedule that we snagged from Flagstaff. You know, our fees don't really align with that, so we'd need to do some tweaking to the totality of the document. But sections like that we can definitely comment on. Right now, we don't get into there's a clear line of demarcation between the private development world and kind of what we do to service them. So there would be, if the city is participating in maybe partnership with a workforce housing developer, that's when we might look at more of the books and peek under the hood, if you will, as to the company and whether we want to step into partnership with them before any recommendation would go to council. So I think there's a way to do it, but maybe only for select projects, not saying that any developer out there would need to go through this rigorous process. That's just a conversation we need to have. But I think if they're asking for and receiving incentives from the city, we should have a look. How that happens, when that happens, and what projects it happens on, I think is the conversation. So sorry for the non-answer, but that is absolutely something we can look more intently at and give you an answer to when we get all of your feedback on the rest of the document.
Later in this document, it talks about performance bond and completion bond. Wouldn't we sort of be covering it then if we required those bonds on a project like that?
So we currently require bonding for the public infrastructure elements through the general engineering standards. But if we're asking for a bond, a performance bond above and beyond that relative to the workforce, I don't believe we currently look at the books of all of the contractors that are required to submit the performance bonds. Is that what you're asking, if we do any level of eligibility or look at during that process of taking that in?
When I read this, I took it to be a completion bond on the workforce portion of a development,
Okay.
that we required that. So if the developer can post that, then why are we dipping into his financials? In other words, the bond company does that. They dip into it.
I guess it's the level of scrutiny that the committee recommends to council for this developer receiving further incentives. It is a bunch. Yeah, there's two, so that we're basically hitting them on the front end and the back end is what you're saying. Yeah. Did you want to speak to?
Connie can tell me, council liaison. Randy, you're absolutely right. You know, as a contractor, you already have to be licensed and bonded. I think what this is asking for, remember, this is not ours, this is our chance. Although I am in favor of an additional bond, basically as a guarantee of completion. Now, is that satisfactory for you? Yeah. Okay. It's a way of it's a promise. It's a promise that you'll complete what you said you're going to do. And it's I know I've had to do it myself on some projects. It costs a little bit of money, but it's not exorbitant. I don't know if anybody else has ever had to do that, but it's just an additional bond to guarantee completion of the project.
What I wouldn't want to see is that we approve let's say 100 unit development, and so many percentage is going to be workforce of those 100 units. So the builder builds 80 units, the normal units he's going to sell at market, and then doesn't have the money to finish the workforce portion.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Right. And I don't know that dipping into his financials in the front end, I don't know.
No, I agree with you. The bonding company should be able to do an analysis, and they'll decide on the amount of the bond that you can afford. And it could be an LLC. A lot of times what happens is several contractors will form a separate LLC in order to make that bond, because then you're combining your financials with 3 or 4 other developers to meet the demand.
Randy, can I take a minute on that and offer the banking perspective? In the banking world with construction loans, we used to qualify builders, and at this point, that language has been changed to validate. And the validation process just ensures that they don't have any pending litigation that would sneak up on it and impact their current financials. So it's a deep dive into the fulfillment of the capacity and also mitigating that liability, because there could be, an unforeseen lawsuit that could have an impact on that that's often overlooked. And I think if there's a vetting process in there, it's going to ensure that the end result is delivered. So, how discouraging that vetting process is to a prospective builder is something I think needs to be treated with sensitivity, because we want to make sure that we encourage the right developers without, discouraging them to not move forward with a project.
Well, and there is a section that addresses that inside of this policy. You must be, free of any liens or lawsuits, or, I mean, we're looking, obviously, or anybody's looking for people that are in good standing, both with the registrar and the IRS or whatever entity would be watching after that. Nicole, do you mind if I go back to what you were talking about on that last developer qualification sentence?
Sure.
So developers must demonstrate financial stability, relevant project experience, and a commitment to providing housing that meets the design standards and affordability requirements. If I were you, I would suggest taking the word design out and inserting building standards, because when you float into design, the exterior design of a unit can make or break a project. If you're going to be now asking these affordable housing builders to, put stone all over it and shutters and window boxes, they're not going to be able to do that. So you might want to make sure that the minimum requirement is to meet the building standards. Just a suggestion. And Randy, you know that the outside elements can really add up a lot. So if you're going into a community that has a design standard and they require, let's say, a third, and a third of different types of applications on the outside, stone, stucco, and up here maybe some siding of some sort, lap siding, that's going to really put the budget over the top. So maybe we take the word design out of there and put building standards instead of requiring a very strict design standard that could be already existent in the PAD, the planned area development, like Mike's the Granite Dells. I don't know if you have a stone requirement, but it looks like you may have requirements for stone on the outside. And from a bottom line requirement, if we require design standards in some of these, it's going to really put a lot of people over the top. So you might want to consider just focusing on building standards. Thank you.
Sorry to keep beating a dead horse, and this might be more for legal that's sitting right there. What concerns me is who determines from the city side that they qualify when we look at their financials. And if they bond, the bonding company does that. The bonding company certifies their financials, and then all we do is set the bond amount that we require. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah. So, I mean, the bottom line, I think what we're talking about here is posting financial assurances. I mean, if the developer is going to get incentives from the city, then my recommendation is not get into the weeds, but make them post financial assurances to cover the entire project. And that way, if they fail, the city has financial assurances to go back on and complete a project.
And my sense is that sort of already exists in our codes. Our general engineering standards require 10% overall project bonding in the form of either a performance bond, an unconditional letter of credit without a time period, ending trust agreements that can be drawn up, actual cash into a city bond. So my sense is I wouldn't get too wrapped up in that because it already sort of exists in our codes. You may be bringing up a separate issue in that if the city's going into partnership with someone in particular, would the city want to take the deeper dive into someone's finances, take a look at their profit and loss sheets and things like that. We do occasionally do that when we do development agreements where the city is contributing significant amounts. We want to make sure that people that we're in business with have the financial wherewithal to kind of complete a project. But my sense is with the types of building projects we're looking at here with workforce housing, that our existing codes probably take care of that. We do require bonding. We do require, especially for off-site public improvements. It just exists. I haven't thought about too much going beyond what exists in code as far as getting maybe into business with a particular developer. And I don't know if community development has any thoughts on that, but we'll let her. Typically what we'll do, I'll tell you, if we are looking at someone's finances, we usually do it under seal. We'll take a look at them. have the council look at them, and then have an understanding that those will be returned to the developer and/or destroyed, so they're not part of kind of the public record.
Hi again. So again, I think the recommendation is just what was culled together from other communities and how they're doing it. It's the committee's option to decide whether that makes sense for us and whether you want to recommend it. I don't think that section is a recommendation necessarily from staff. This is just a, hey, this is how everybody else is doing it. But to Randy's point, if it doesn't make sense and the bonding is covering us there already, then by all means, it's the committee's prerogative to strike that out or leave it in and ask council if that's something that they want. But I don't think it's necessary when we have the bonding and requiring the higher bonding, to Mayor Pro Tem's point, makes sense for the workforce housing. Look, if you are engaging in this activity and you're getting this incentive, this is the extra mile that we expect you to go. So it's really up to the committee whether you want to leave that other check in place.
Well, I appreciate what you just said, and here's why. When I walk up to the building counter in other cities and I'm going to do a project, it's about red tape. How much red tape, how many hoops do I have to jump through, what do I got to fill out? And I'm seeing this like it's just another discouragement to a developer when we're going to require the bonding anyway. And I want to streamline this event so that the developer feels comfortable, because we heard that loud and clear last Thursday night, did we not? Make it easy, make it streamlined, so that we understand it, we can get through the process. And I just want to, if we can, eliminate some of the hurdles. That's all.
So, having been on both sides of this fence, I agree with you, speaking from my contractor hat, okay? But if you're talking about the liability to the citizens, the taxpayers, I think at the very least we need a performance bond. Okay. Because then the taxpayers end up owning it and having to figure out how to complete it. And it's more money, as you know. So.
Sounds like we're in agreement on that topic.
Yeah, just, I don't want to get into the weeds again, but not a performance bond, a completion bond. Yeah. Or any form of financial assurances, whether it's a bond, an irrevocable letter of credit, trust account, or cash. I mean, any of those things can be posted. But the bottom line is they need to demonstrate financial strength through financial assurances.
On page 9 for us, it's section 2A, development fee incentives. I am a little concerned about the sentences that read, all fee reductions are subject to the availability of city funding and based on the Prescott City Council's policy-making discretion. If funding is not available at the time of project approval, fee reductions may not be granted. I feel like that's a really slippery slope. It's very subjective. And I would recommend that we eliminate that altogether. If we're committed as a city to providing these incentives, it should be very clear and very much based in what the project is proposing to do for our workforce.
And I think the first sentence says it also. The city of Prescott may waive, so it doesn't require them to waive anyway. So it is kind of duplicative.
Yeah, who decides if it says may? I mean,
Well, we don't want to take my opinion is you don't want to box the city into requiring them to do something that at some point doesn't make sense. So we're dealing with issues right now that I think the city is getting boxed in to things that will come back to haunt them later. And I think there needs to be language in here that gives staff and council flexibility.
So I can remove that last paragraph. We can leave it as may. I believe, especially depending on certain fees, those have to come to council. And someone in the audience, correct me if I'm wrong, but like impact fees, if they were to get covered by the city or something to that extent, that would have to be a council decision. So some of them, it might just depend on the type of fee that's being asked to be waived.
My sense of it is it'll be covered by whatever policy is in existence at the time somebody comes and tries to pull permits. That last sentence looks like just standard budget appropriation law that we throw into every contract saying, you know, payment on this contract is subject to availability of funding in any particular fiscal year. But I don't have a problem necessarily taking it out if we leave the word may in there up top, because that gives the discretion. Where you'll find that will be whatever policy is in effect at the time. So the city adopts a policy in fiscal year 24-25 that says, if you meet certain categories for workforce housing, we will reimburse permit fees, or we won't require planning and zoning fees or something like that. Those are my thoughts, is that you'll find it in whatever policy exists at the time, and that's ultimately a council policy.
My only comment on all that would be just consistency across the board, because developers talk to each other. So I don't know how you do that, but consistency, right, guys? So contractor A gets treated just like contractor B.
Well, and I'm not sure, Amber, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that we address any kind of like review, how these come in, when they come in, who reviews them to determine eligibility. So that's something that we'll need to ferret out a little bit, right? So in the application process, when a developer comes forward and says, I'd like to take advantage of the incentive program, that's when we would presumably look at the project to determine, okay, is it eligible? Is it hitting all of the right points from the policy, whatever council adopts? And then there's the discussion at that point. You know, our desire to offer these incentives are really based on what the developer brings forward and if it's in line with the ultimate goal. So I think it will depend project to project how it works, but having, like Mike said, not boxing council in and not boxing, future participants' hands, or boxing them in rather, I think is important. It'll be a case by case a lot of the time, but I think clearly lining out, hey, this is how far we're willing to go, bring us a good project that fits within the scope. But there needs to be some sort of process that determines the eligibility and how we can move forward together.
We're bringing on a third party to help set up the whole workforce deal, right? I forget what company it's called. But would we consider them as part of the helping us to qualify that person because of the third party, they're not the city?
I think that's an option, like to help look at future applications for this process. Yeah, I mean, that's up to you guys.
I think we're getting into some details. I can't imagine a project coming forward that would not require a development agreement. And each development agreement will look at what that developer is bringing forward and determine what positive aspects will be fed into the community. So I think if you start boxing it in too much, I think we're going to find if you get too much into the weeds, we're going to find ourselves eliminating the possibility for someone to come in with either a project that includes lots of workforce housing eligible elements versus a limited amount. But any amount is good. Mm-hmm. But I think what they bring forward and what goes into a development agreement will depend on how far the city should go on incentivizing that. So I may be wrong, but I don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all here.
I also think that if at the initiation, when they come to us and say, here's what we want to do, it depends upon what the budget is at that particular time. The city may have said, we don't have this available at this time, and it would come out in that initial, when the builder comes to us and says, here's what I want to do. If you don't have the funding for a certain portion of this, you just tell them then, and they can still make their decision. We're not going to say everybody gets 1 through 10, no matter what. It's you got to consider what the city's putting up too, and if they don't have it that year or at that particular time, that's just the way of doing business. And in half of my life being in banking, this was an everyday thing. Never was any customer treated the same as the other, because it was an individual decision between you and the customer, and whatever the rules were at that time. I mean, your brother could come in and get a loan and get this term, and a year later, you come in and I can't offer you the same thing. That happens in city government all the time. Things get cut, they get expanded. So I think if it's disclosed at the very beginning, this is what we have available, then the person requesting to do this, if he accepts it, he knows what the limitations are already. I think we get, and Mike's right, we keep adding and adding and adding and adding, and it's going to get so tight nobody's going to ever want to do this program, in my opinion.
Can I add real quick too? I do think that, and I've asked Amber to put this in there, I think it has to be on a case-by-case basis. And let me give you an example. If you have a builder that comes in and there's going to be 100 units, but he chooses to only make 10 units workforce housing, does that builder then have the right to have 100% of his fees waived? No, I think it has to be on a case-by-case basis and a sliding scale. If you do 10% of your workforce housing your project as workforce housing, then I think you should be eligible for a 10% forgiveness in the fees. Now, remember what we just came through here, which is the whole reason that we ended up having the 478 with the fact that we had basically zero impact fees charged for police and fire. That's how we got ourselves into a $133 million deferment, because there were no impact fees. And remember, there were no impact fees or very minimal impact fees for the last 15 years. It did not spur on workforce housing. So I don't know how today is going to be any different. But let's say somebody wants to step forward and do it. It really has to be on a case-by-case basis with the amount of workforce housing inside of the PAD, the planned area development, or the, whatever they're going to do in terms of the rest of the housing. So I don't see how you cannot have it on a case-by-case basis. It has to just be that way if you're going to get any kind of an incentive. Just my thought. I think that needs to be added to that.
I think there is a chart proposed and something that we need to talk through in terms of the scale based on the AMI, the percentage that's waived or reimbursed. What are your guys' thoughts on all of that?
Can I actually go back for 1 second? Sorry. Mike's. Real quick, I have a note from Luther just on the affordability requirements under eligibility, which kind of goes into the development agreement. He recommended removing the minimum period of 24 years and putting in period of time consistent with their development agreement so that it doesn't box people in. How do you feel about that?
Comment. This is also later in this document about developers maintaining, and I was going to bring it up then, but you just asked. We tell them they got to do it, but we don't tell them how to do it. For the life of me, I don't know how a developer does that. In other words, take American Ranch Development. The HOA was formed by the developer, right? But then he eventually stepped down and turned it over to the citizens and walked away. How do we need to outline some kind of mechanism to do it, I think. Otherwise, every developer is going to be engineering or designing their own way of doing it. We don't know if it works or not.
So LIHTC currently is at a 30-year guarantee?
I believe so. That's what Gorman had said. So we can, it's up to the committee. We can have that specific year in there or change it to whatever year you want. I just threw something in there. But, or we could open it up more broad to get into it more with development agreements for just a period of time consistent with their development agreement. I just don't know how you guys feel about having a specific time in there or the development agreement, and then we could get into the mechanism of how they do that later.
I mean, personally, I like the idea of a minimum period, but I'd like to hear. I mean, Chelsea, do you how much do these development agreements change? I mean, are we saying somebody could come in and say they only have to do affordable, attainable housing for 1 year, and then they get the same reimbursement? That doesn't seem fair.
Well, I mean, Connie kind of said it best. Each project is going to be different. It's going to depend on the product type. It's going to depend on what they're doing and what their involvement is going to be. A lot of these projects cull together a patchwork quilt of funding in order to make it happen. And there's typically a lot of strings attached, especially when it comes to the LIHTC funds. So it really depends on the product, on the project itself. So I would probably go with whatever the development agreement says. Now, the development agreement is project specific, so it would line out what the timelines are, et cetera, and those don't typically change. Those are, I mean, they can be amended from time to time for specific provisions, but usually you line out how the project is going to function and what the triggers are, what the responsibilities of each party is, and then it's set to go and the project moves forward. So kind of getting back to allowing for flexibility within the policy and then allowing these other vehicles and documents to speak to the specificity behind each of the projects is probably the way to go on that provision.
What about part of the incentive program? The longer they stay involved in controlling workforce housing costs, then their incentives are higher. And like Nicole said, what if they're there a year or 5 years versus 20 years? Mm-hmm. The 20-year guy gets a bigger incentive. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, that would be something that the committee could look at that section and decide to put that in part of the narrative. Again, not speaking to the specifics, because again, it's going to depend on what the project is and how well they're doing. But yeah, and I'm not sure how you would offer. Okay, just thinking of their long-term, how you would guarantee that at the beginning would be very difficult. So. I would say that would be something that would be worked out in development agreement discussions. Like, hey, we're going to be in this thing together for 50 years. The incentives are going to look a lot different than if you're with us for 5, to your point. But again, the development agreement is likely where those discussions would take place.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, but I think without some sort of a guideline for a minimum, we're kind of setting ourselves up. And Randy, to your point, I agree when it comes to, for instance, a homeowners association. Once the developer finishes out, he turns it over to the homeowners and then walks away. But if the city's going to give incentives, we need some sort of assurance that it's going to stay workforce for a minimum amount of time. Hopefully in perpetuity. And it will be a perpetuity in perpetuity if it's a land trust or a 501c3 or something like that. I think you will find that will take care of itself. But if it's a private development, I do think there should be some minimum standard. And if they want to propose more than that to get more incentives, then that's up to them. But I think we need to start with a minimum. I really do. Mm-hmm. I don't. My thoughts are 20 years looks pretty good to me, frankly.
May I, Nicole? Okay, here's a suggestion. Anybody that's had a development agreement understands that every single development agreement can be administratively amended. So what you need to do is you need to tie a string to those incentives. Upon completion of your workforce housing, you would receive that incentive back. Because if you give the incentive up front, and we've had this happen here, by the way, they take the incentive and then 10, 15 years down the road, they amend the DA to make the multifamily go away, and it turns into single family. So I think you do need to attach a string to those incentives. Once they complete the workforce housing component, 10%, you receive your money back. Because otherwise we do have, it's happened, and that you know that they can be amended. And it's not that difficult to have it happen that way. Sometimes it's under the cloak of darkness, believe me. But I would just suggest that. If you really want to make it happen, you need to attach a string to those incentives upon completion of your workforce housing component. If it's 10%, 15, whatever the component is. Just a thought.
So perhaps that could answer the question under the fees eligibility list when it says reimbursement, that we clarify when that is.
The concern I would have with that is we just created another hurdle. So if they post financial assurances that they're going to finish the project, I agree development agreements can be modified down the road, but a modified development agreement has to go to council. So council can say no.
Development agreements, if they're amended, would have to go to the council. They cannot be administratively amended by staff.
I guess, Mike, what I'm talking about is, remember the mock scenario we did on the sixplex unit downtown on city property? And when I got it done, there's absolutely no money in it whatsoever. And I put a 10-year on that one because in 10 years, the developer can then go to market. So for 10 years, we do get workforce housing. How long are we going to ask somebody to wait to actually make any money on this deal? Because there's no money in that at all.
Something that's not in here, and I know I'm kind of going to a different direction, but it's on your topic, is I do think we should consider a density bonus, because that is a really great way to make it pencil. If they have the ability to create a higher density on their parcel, and then a certain percentage is workforce housing, the other elements that are more at market rate can then help subsidize that project naturally.
So that's actually under section 2D in zoning.
Sorry, I missed that.
That's okay.
I apologize.
So could we get possibly a form of consensus on if you guys want an actual time period in there, or to leave that generic to the development agreement? We'll start with that.
I like Mike's suggestion of the 20-year minimum and that flexibility to be able to have perhaps further incentives if a developer offers greater than that time frame.
And Randy, if a project does need a shorter time frame, going to staff and eventually in council to have that waived is a possibility. But I think we start with a minimum, is my feeling.
Yeah, I don't mind the minimum. I just think 20 is kind of heavy, but this is a council, so whatever year we vote, then that's what it is.
Well, we just recommend.
Okay.
Okay, so this chart is a fee eligibility list draft from Flagstaff. It is fully Flagstaff's numbers. If you like the concept, it would be something that our community development and public works would then go and put in our information. But something to focus on would be, do you like the reimbursement or the waiver? Do you want a percentage like that? Do you want it based off of the scale that I think is on the next page? So just the concept as a whole, these numbers are extremely going to be fluid because this is Flagstaff's numbers. And I can easily flip between the two pages if you want to see the scale and then go back and look at this.
Well, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel, so I think it's a great starting point. Waiver or reimbursed would fall back to Connie's point. If there is a possibility it won't get finished, meaning our financial assurances follow current code, which does not require 100% assured, then a reimbursement would be appropriate. If we add a financial assurance that says, listen, if you're going to get these incentives, you're going to financially assure the entire project, then it can be waived up front because we know the city has a fund to go, or a bond or a letter of credit to go finish the project.
I agree with Mike.
Okay. Then we'll have our staff look at that and turn it into Prescott numbers, and we'll put somewhere in there waived or reimbursed depending on project and portion, and we'll work up some verbiage on that. So I do have a note. All right, if we're going on to the second section, from Luther on this one, that in the initial paragraph, he asked at the end, it says, this can be done by only checking for permit code items and leaving the rest of the plans as is, i.e. leaving spell checks and plan discrepancies to the builders and inspectors. I don't think he wants that actual sentence added, but kept in mind.
Can we go back to the waiver and reimbursement scale? To me, this one feels a little overwhelming because I do feel like we need some more flexibility within this. You know, for example, if somebody's bringing in 100 units and is still willing to do 10%, they should get something. So I don't know. I just don't know what do you guys feel about the scale? And I don't want it to be crazy detailed. I've seen some other municipalities that have really, really detailed reimbursement schedules, but I do think maybe this could use some improvement.
So are you thinking lower, or maybe having 3 of these where one's 10%, one's 20%, and one's over 20%, like just adding in some additional, or?
Are you referring to the last sentence that says minimum of 20% workforce units?
Yeah, I guess there's 2 layers there, right? It's up to 20% and then greater than 20%. I don't know. How do you guys feel about that overall? I guess for me, I really want to see some tangible numbers. And I love if we had an example project that maybe could fit this criteria that's been through the community development department recently. Could we look at a sample project at the next meeting to really put some numbers together of what are we saying we're waiving with real fees? Because for me, it feels a little bit abstract, just not ever having done a development agreement myself.
I saw a head nod from Chelsea, so I think we can work on that.
Yeah, if you look at the table prior to that, it talks about zoning fees, subdivision fees, site plan fees, building plan review, permit and inspection fees, and then in the utility department, a development fee. So I think it does identify what fees we're talking about. And I didn't see up to 20%. I didn't get that.
This page.
Got it. Okay, I see it.
Chelsea, do any projects come to mind that would be appropriate to theoretically test this on?
Well, Connie had a great idea of one that's coming up. They haven't submitted for permits yet, and but we could use their PAC notes and what they submitted for that pre-application. I don't want to give any names or anything like that, so we can use what they're proposing as far as their unit count and mock something up. Again, we haven't taken the project through the fee process yet, but I'm sure we could mock something up for the committee to give an idea of what all of the percentages mean in actual dollars. And we'll just make some assumptions on our part and give you something to look at.
Yeah, I agree. It would be helpful, especially because there's some language that could add to the confusion. Minimum, up to, being able to see those numbers broken down to supplement this would help add clarification.
And then how complicated does the math get if somebody's doing mixed AMI served? So maybe 20% of their project is 60 to 80%, and then the other 20% is 80 to 100, and then the rest is over 100. Is that hard to do? I mean, I guess I'm not a math major, so maybe that's a silly question.
Yeah, I think we'll just make one up. I think the real projects that come in are likely going to be within one range or the other. I don't anticipate fair housing rules. I don't think allow for a lot of like different within the same project, different offerings within the same project. So I think real projects are going to come in in a certain area, but maybe we'll use the exercise and look at different, just to give you a number, look at the different percentages throughout.
I have a question also. So based on just this slide right here, we're basically taking out anybody that would want to do 10%. So you're saying this is implying that you have to meet the 20% threshold, period. Do you want to explore something, again, on a sliding scale? So you would allow 10%, or, again, it's a relief. If you're going back to the development fee incentives, aren't you? I mean, what I'm getting from sitting in on all of these is we're desperate and we want to allow any kind of workforce housing. But if you go on this, you have to meet that 20% threshold.
As I'm reading the chart, it looks like 20% and less is that first chart. So it could be 1% in that first chart, right? If you had a project that was 1% serving 60 to 70% AMI, they would get 100% of their percentage wave. That's why I'm questioning these charts. I don't know if we've got it where we want it to be.
And I do think that this is confusing when you're talking about the AMI. But is there a way to simplify that and, again, attach the reimbursements to the amounts of actual structures built?
I think it's percentage, and I agree with what you just said. If they only build one workforce housing unit, that's one more than we have today. So it's a percentage based, and I think the reimbursements and incentives should be tied to the percentage. Because what if he's only building 10 houses? Well, one house is 10%.
So couldn't you just theoretically, and I'm not saying to do this, but couldn't you theoretically just get rid of that and say that for total project units built, the percentage of total project workforce housing units built, or you can come up with something, but I don't know, just a suggestion. But I do think that this, to the average person, is going to be a little confusing. But
All right, we'll get crafty on that.
Keep in mind, we're trying to attract a workforce housing contractor, developer, to come and help us with this. So as we reduce those percentages, we reduce the incentive and we potentially chase someone off. So I don't know the answer. I guess I fall back on Flagstaff's. Again, I don't want to reinvent the wheel, and Flagstaff has a track record. So I wonder if this isn't a very good starting point, and then as we get some examples or some some history behind it here in Prescott, then we can make some modifications at that point.
So I just want to go back to that example and make sure that I'm reading it correctly. If we're using the Flagstaff chart, if it's the project up to 20%, that first chart, let's just say it was 100 units and they were going to do one that was serving 60 to 70% AMI. If I'm reading this correctly, it says we're going to waive 100% of all of these fees. Is that really what we're wanting?
No, under that example, you're absolutely right. You wouldn't want to do that.
So should we have a minimum percentage if we're talking about this chart? Maybe it's 10%. What do you think is reasonable?
Well, I go back to what I said a minute ago. I think it should be a percentage of the project. Let's say a small time guy wants to do 10 houses. Forget the 100 house thing for a minute. Guy's going to build 10 houses. So if he has to do 20%, then that means 2 of the 10 have to be workforce. The workforce are not going to pencil, you know. It's going to help him get his development going, but it's not really going to pencil very strong. So I think it should just be percentage based, because we have to look at, you know, small projects versus big projects. What do we care if it's 10 small projects or 1 big project? We still net the same amount of workforce. That's all.
We've spent a lot of time on this. We've got a couple months on this. Is there a way to reach out to Flagstaff and ask I think they have a workforce housing liaison up there, and say, how's this work for you? And give us some examples and chase this down?
Yeah, I can talk to them and hopefully have some information back to you guys at the next meeting.
How about this? I volunteer to go up there and talk to them, and I welcome somebody else from the committee to go with me, because I'd like to hear it straight away, and I'd like to ask these questions to them to see if they've thought them through.
No. But thank you for volunteering to go up there and talk to them. I think that's a great idea.
What I can do is I'll initiate the conversation, and then we'll find a date and time for either you to go up there, them to come down here, a Teams meeting, some sort of contact, because it would be better for you to ask the questions than for me, just to make sure that you're asking the questions you want the answers to.
Thanks, Randy.
So we'll get into detail on that at the next meeting then.
All right. So on this one, again, Luther just had a note for that first paragraph that it could be done by checking for permit code items, leaving the rest of the plans as is, leaving spell checks and plan discrepancies to the builders and inspectors. Sorry, even trying to make it bigger, it's still small, but
What was Luther's comments on that?
so no, so I just got his this morning, so I'm just reading from what I have. And he just put that for that whole top paragraph, this can be done by only checking for permit code items and leaving the rest of the plans as is, such as leaving spell checks and plan discrepancies to the builders and inspectors.
I guess I don't understand where he's going.
And he can maybe speak to that more at the next meeting if it's something that he's passionate about putting in there.
Yeah, I think we need more information on that.
Amber, can you read that one more time? Do you have your microphone on?
Yeah, so his notes were this can be done by only checking for permit code items and leaving the rest of the plans as is, i.e., leaving spell checks and plan discrepancies to the builders and inspectors. And I don't know if he's discussing, in the past he's mentioned that he felt, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong when he gets back in, but that there might have been some changes that were minor that didn't need to go back, and Chelsea might be able to speak to that. But I know he's mentioned things like this in the past.
Sure. I think that's a comment on the granular level of how our plan review team reviews plans. So that is something that we're working on internally as a department to make sure that we're being consistent with the code calls and we're not calling things that waste time or that elongate a project unnecessarily. So I don't know if those need to be worked into the policy language so much as it is if the committee wants to recommend the timeline reduction and council approves that, it will be incumbent upon community development to make sure that we're meeting that standard. So, and it'll be up to community development to figure out to council, okay, here's how we can meet that guideline. If we're underwater, we have on-call contracts. So maybe figuring out a way that we meet this policy if council adopts it as it is.
The only thing I'd like to add to that is not in this document, but we need to let the other developers know, it's like teaching them, that they could get bumped in line if a workforce project comes. If everybody kind of starts learning that and understands it, they'll stop complaining. In the beginning, they're going to complain no matter what because they're not used to it. But down the road, if we educate the other developers that aren't doing workforce that they could get bumped, then they understand why.
I don't know if the prioritization and expedited review section would maybe be beneficial to them reading that, but that's there too.
No, I said not part of this document. I just think we need to let other developers know when they bring us a project or bring the city a project that's had nothing to do with workforce, like a disclosure almost that they could get bumped. That's all.
All right, anything else on this slide? So I know it's been discussed in the past that sometimes we get responsibility put on our community development, that they're the ones slowing it down. Sometimes it's put on the engineers that they're slowing it down. This section says that there's a shared responsibility for timely review. So while the city will be committed to expediting the review process, the speed also depends significantly on the quality of the applicant's submittals and their responsiveness throughout the process. And even puts in their expedited review may be discontinued if the developer fails to meet these responsibilities. So that kind of puts it on both ends. Everyone's responsible to play nice together.
So if we move forward to section 2C, I think why I glossed over it is because it was as a bullet point, but I do think density bonus might require some further conversation with the committee. Do we want to have an example of a chart like we're doing with the other incentives? Because I do think it's a really strong tool to allow these projects to pencil.
I go back to my comment on the fees we said earlier. I think some discussion with Flagstaff and understanding what their experience is will go a long ways.
Can I ask everybody on the committee, if I'm the guinea pig that's going to go up there, email me your questions and I'll take them with me? Is that?
No, don't do that. Email me your questions. Yeah, email me. Then we'll get them to you.
And then you'll send them to me?
We'll sort that. We'll make sure that you have all of the appropriate material you need to be adequately prepared for the meeting.
You're going with me, right, Amber?
We'll make sure you're adequately prepared for that. We'll see. We'll talk to them, and then if time and everything allows, I can try to go with you.
I think it'd also be valuable to know when you do meet with Flagstaff to find out, did they do a great deal of market research? Are they looking at a variety of different municipalities, or are they just getting started? Because I don't know their history either.
think you just found your partner for the road trip.
No.
I think you just found your partner for the road.
No, I can't do that. I trust Randy.
So, and not all of these are probably strictly from, and I have no doubt Flagstaff probably has a density bonus, but I took this information from Flagstaff, Tucson, and general practices throughout the state and country as well.
Nicole, you know, this density bonuses is a trap, in my opinion. And what is, when you're saying right here, more than, let me see, what is it? More units per acre than typically allowed under current zoning regulations. If you start to jump into trying to change the zoning regulations, you talk about a slowdown. Can you speak to that? The process in order to get the zoning density changed is a quite lengthy one. I mean, do you want to just keep that in there as an option, and if they decide to go through that process? But, you know, again, has anybody ever gone through a zoning change process? It's a long, long process. So
I guess my question would be, are there density bonus programs that are part of the city policy that expedite that process? Because it's a given that if you're building X amount of workforce housing, you automatically have 10% more density or whatever the case may be.
the reality of that is probably no, but Chelsea will know more about that. But it's just a long process. I don't even know why they put that in there, because unless, of course, a workforce housing builder has decided 2 years out that, and he's got 2 years to mess around with it. I mean, it could potentially work that way, but it is a long process.
So, I mean, it is a process for sure. There are currently density bonuses or shifting things around as it relates to planned area developments. So in the code, a planned area development, if they're providing more open space, can have density allocated in different areas at a more compact rate. I think it's 6,000 square foot lots is allowed when you provide open space and clustering of the developments right now. So I guess the question would be at what rate, and if the committee is recommending further density bonuses and what that might look like. But yeah, it would be a zoning change, and it would require going through the process. So we'd have to make sure that the land development code and the policy that council ultimately decides on are in sync. It can be done, but the question is how much, and understanding that the applicant will have to go through the process. A lot of the development projects that we see do have entitlement processes already. So it just depends on where they're going and what entitlements they need for the project. But it will be a zoning application of some sort regarding density if it's not allowed by right at current density in that particular zoning designation wherever they're deciding to go.
Is there a way to expedite that process? Are you aware of other programs in the country that are doing that?
I'm not aware of other programs in the country that are doing that, and it would have to be a code change to allow for expedited processing. It would still have to follow the land development code with a staff review, and then to planning and zoning, and then to council. And that depends right now primarily on their availability with meeting dates. So to ask to expedite that further, expedite the process timeframe further, I don't know how we would do that, but again, it would depend on what council wants to get that provision of the policy over the hurdle. I don't think we could skip without a big zoning, a land development code change. We couldn't skip one of the processes, for instance, skip from planning and zoning and go straight to council. If that's what council wants, we could do it. But again, that would take a land development code change. So I guess the question is, what does the committee want us to look at, and what ultimately will council desire to enact? Did you have?
I get where Nicole's coming from because it comes down to units per acre. You know this, Connie. So the more units per acre, it makes it more affordable for the developer. And this is sort of just thinking off the top of my head, but is there a way we could get out in front of that as a city and look at some design changes and then say if a workforce project comes along, it fits in that criteria because we already reviewed it as a city and took those 2 years to do that. And now you can increase your density by X because we already looked at it?
That would require taking away the requirement of 25% open space left open, theoretically, in a PAD, a planned area development. But for Nicole's benefit, we already have currently today a reduction down to 5 feet between homes. That's very, very small. So the next project would have to be something that would have a shared wall, a townhome or whatever. But to Randy's, just to educate you on that, but to Randy's point, in order to create the density in a lot or whatever plot, let's say, whatever the builder has, it would have to be, the only other way to create the density is to take away the requirement of the 25% open space, that's requirement. Can you think of any other way that it would be done?
Well, and that's relative to single-family lot sizes and the planned area development. So when we're talking about density bonuses, we need to think kind of broader about all of the density that's allowed in all of our zoning districts. So how many dwelling units per acre is what we calculate for everything. I guess how to do it is something that we can definitely research and see what other communities are doing, what Flagstaff is doing. It might be a push just in the community, but I think we should investigate it.
Can I make a quick suggestion that might simplify? And again, nix me if you don't like it. But we could actually simplify this whole section to say the city may modify certain development standards up to the discretion of council depending on the project or something like that, where we could even put possibly such as these options and not pigeonhole anybody. Could we make it just broader to where if council liked it, they could direct staff to look further into it, but we don't have to find out the details of it right this second because I don't know. What are your thoughts on that about keeping it broader?
I think if we're going to go to super high density and have a density program, they're going to have to go to before planning and zoning anyway, unless they're already unless they're already zoned commercial, and it is, for instance, a build-to-rent product. So it's going to fall under that multifamily category, and it's going to go very. I think we're spending way too much time on this. If it's not entitled, they're going to have to go through the entitlement process. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're going to ever change the entitlement process. And I would be absolutely against changing open space requirements. I think it should be higher already.
Right.
You want to take that out?
No, I think having it in there provides an opportunity for somebody to take a look at that, and it just opens up the conversation, I guess, is the one nice thing I like about it. But they're still going to have to go through the entitlement process.
And I don't see the expedited review process. I don't see that necessarily linked to the entitlement expediting that. If it's calling back to section 2B, then we're talking about permit review time. So recognizing that expedited review process for a entitlement, those aren't the same.
Yeah, and that's by state statute anyway, I believe.
Yeah, depending on what it is, yeah.
Right.
If I may, right here, under density bonus, I think changing it from the city will allow to the city will consider would probably eliminate a lot of that.
Yeah, I had a similar thought. Just change the word will to may. The city may allow, and then leave it up to the council's discretion.
I might go through and do that. Unless you see one that you really want as a will, I might go through and just change all of the wills to mays just to be safe.
So we've got about 40 minutes left, give or take. Should we get into just any big picture comments that any of the committee has in regards to the overall document?
Well, I think this is pretty important for us as a committee. This is the meat and potatoes of what we've been working on for a year and a half. I don't really want to rush through this, you guys. If we have to another meeting, I think we should really develop this as tight as we can, as helpful as we can. And I don't want to rush because I got a lot of comments and it's going to drag on. So.
Sure, and I don't mean to rush. I just mean we don't want to get into the minutia of little edits, just things that require conversation.
This is a question for Amber. Amber, is this the last meeting on this, or can we have another one? Because I happen to think what you're doing today, the panel, remember, the devil is in the details. I think you need to do this. I think it's healthy. I think every single thing in here needs to be scrutinized, and I would be in favor to take as long as it takes, because once this policy is out there, and remember, you got to play to the council also. You got to think about what we're dealing with now and what we have been dealing with. And if you want to have success in this, you got to really pay attention to that. But I think if it takes 2 more meetings or whatever it's going to take, I think you need to do it. I think what you're doing right now is exactly right. Scrutinize it.
So we could definitely take March and April. My only concern is that we do have a study session at the end of May. There isn't a council meeting at the beginning of May, and due to the moving of council chambers, I don't know if we'll have a meeting at the beginning of May. We do want to make sure council has time to review the policy. They're going to go through it as well, but having something comfortable that you're comfortable discussing and bringing to them at the study session for everyone to work through together is important. But we could take March and have the April one be any final details, review a final draft, and go from there. So we could do that, but I do think going through it as efficiently as we can is good.
Well, that would give me time to do the Flagstaff field trip too.
And for today, I just need maybe the last 5 minutes to go through the rest of the slides. So we have until 11:55 to keep going.
So are we on water policy, 2E? Is that where we're at?
So there is 2D zoning, which kind of goes into some additional informations like ADUs, which council's working on. And then different types. Density bonus program is in there as well because it would affect zoning. Voluntary workforce housing inclusion has to be voluntary because we can't do inclusive zoning. And project qualifications. So
I propose that we do not discuss the zoning portion specific to the ADUs right now until we get more legislation on that.
do we want to take it out altogether, or is it, let me go back. Is it vague enough? Because I tried to leave that one a little bit vague so it could go flexibly, but we can change the wording on that to be even more.
Just as a side note, we did just address this in council, and we decided to table it until we heard back on the changes of the population requirements.
I had something under project qualifications, the last part of that section 2D. And I said it a little while ago, and I hate to throw this into the monkey wrench, but you know, we're asking these developers to stay workforce for a very long period of time, and we don't give them a mechanism to do it. And I assume some HOA board will take over from the developer at some point. Once again, we don't have any kind of an outline on how to do it. They're going to have to start from scratch, and I don't know how that works. What I'm referring to is the last sentence in project qualifications, if you're looking for it.
Well, on rental units, I think a development agreement runs with the land. So if it's included with the development agreement, it's going to run with the land even after they sell it. When it's purchased property, you know, we might get into deed restrictions or something that identifies that.
Do we want to change the will to may on that one? To where developers may be required to maintain affordability for a specified period? No.
Not if they're getting incentives.
I just think we need to make recommendations of how to do it, Mike, and I really don't know. I'm asking. I'm not proposing anything. I really don't know how you do that. If it's deed restrictions or whatever, we should look into that and bring in some experts to tell us.
Well, how about we let them say how they're going to do that? Leave it the way it is. It'll be required. You tell us how you're going to do that way. Are you going to deed restrict it, or are you going to write it into a contract? What are you going to do to that next buyer to keep it that way? So, I mean, again, I want to keep it as open as possible to attract somebody that will bring workforce housing to this community.
I guess what my concern is that they sound all good up front, and then so many years down the road, they kind of walk away from it, and thing gets out of control, and it's no longer workforce. That's all.
I think your deed restriction is going to have the most bite, if you will. The HOAs get amended all the time. They go to bunk. So if it carries with the land, then it's going to be set in stone.
So if we're moving to the water policy, our water team who came and spoke end of last year, they're going to go through this more, and whatever is in here is going to align with what they say, or we might keep it generic enough to just say refer to the amendment, recommended amendment in the water policy. So that's still kind of a work in progress.
I know this is skipping ahead, but kind of hearing what Randy was saying about and the enforceability part. So if somebody changes, from the original intent to provide housing and it's years down the road, but it's still within whatever time frame we've determined, that clawback provision, can that happen whenever? How does that work? It's on page 26 for me. Section 6B, developer accountability, is the section.
Yeah, we'll have to go over this with legal and look at all the provisions together. But my first inclination is back to what Mike said. We need to be careful not to design the projects for these folks and not to tell them exactly what they're going to do. They need to have some skin in the game. They need to provide us with how they are going to meet our requirements. And one of those would be, how are you going to maintain this in perpetuity, or in the time frame that we require you to maintain the level of affordability for the time period? Is that going to be, which mechanism are you choosing? Let's see that in writing. Let's see it recorded with the Yavapai County assessors, or the Yavapai County recorded documents, and go from there. As far as the clawback and how that would work, I need to dig into that with our legal folks.
Do we want to make recommendations? Like give them so many recommendations of how they could do it, and they could pick one from our list because we pre-qualified that will work, like deed restriction, rather than them coming up with some cockamamie idea that we have to figure out if it works or not, and then we get bamboozled.
Yeah, we can provide them with a list.
I just don't want cockamamie or bamboozled to end up in this document.
But you understood what I meant, right?
By the way, past the clawback provision is the project completion bonds and financial assurances.
Right,
So
and this kind of
it's in
gets
there.
back to the enforcement concerns you had. This is how we enforce that a property maintains its workforce housing status for whatever agreed period of time the city agrees to. Yeah, I've seen them before in kind of grants that I think NACOG used to do some grants for home improvements. So they give you somebody $5,000 to put on, an extension or something. And then it said, you cannot sell this property within 10 years or you will be required to pay back the amount of the grant. So it looks something like that as far as the enforcement mechanisms for the clawback provisions. And then we can probably write into the code fines and penalties that may be associated that the courts can consider if we have to go to court that somebody violated their provisions. Yeah, but these look kind of like what you would expect. We'd have financial assurances that we can go after if they fail to meet their obligations. So, some good ideas. Not sure we're fully there yet, but it gives you an idea of what kind of enforcement mechanisms we'd be looking at.
Could we obtain some examples to look over on that?
Sure.
Do we want to go back to water policy?
So we can. That one I would hold off on talking too much about because our water team's going to create some verbiage that they're comfortable with bringing to you that will encourage people to look at the recommended verbiage for the water policy. So we don't want this policy to say exactly what's going to happen in the water policy because it may or may not get approved. So it might even be something as simple as, please refer to any workforce housing amendments to the water policy. So they're working on that verbiage.
So employee incentives is the next section. I guess I'm curious, has this been vetted at all with the Human Resources Department? Is this something that they're recommending?
So the policy's been sent to any relevant departments to add in any input or anything they'd change. I'll send it out again, but I didn't receive any feedback at this time. But I'll send it out to them again and see if they have any additional feedback.
Is anybody on this committee familiar with the county's efforts right now with workforce in terms of employment and not specific to housing? Okay. I'm going to reach out to the county to see if we can get more under partnership with workforce housing developers, education resources. Right now we have the county making tremendous strides, and I think that if we were to dovetail into what the county is actively doing with these incentives specifically towards the employee portion, I think we're going to gain a lot of traction on that. So that's an area that I can volunteer to get more insight on exactly what the county's doing right now.
Thanks, Arnold.
And I think a lot of these, the way that it's phrased is that it will give direction to HR to do a lot of these and dig into the weeds to create procedures for employees on the inside. So a lot of these aren't specific, like HR will create a housing assistance program, but they will look into it, see what's feasible for our jurisdiction. And yeah, any information you have from the county as well, I'll pass on to them. And this is definitely not as fun of a name as a Home of My Own program. So if you guys want to rename it from Pre-Approved Plans Program, which doesn't sound as fun. But
I like having some consistency so that when someone's in Prescott Valley or the county or here, they know what that means. I think clarity is important in this. And on that point, as I'm learning about the Home of My Own program, I know I don't recall where we had it listed as a goal, but is it possible to just get that done now? It seems like some great low-hanging fruit. And as I'm understanding, it just requires a letter to the county. Is that how that works?
I'll let Chelsea and Mayor Pro Tem speak to that.
I was in contact with Jeremy Dye over the program in the county not too long ago, and all he's waiting for is a memorandum of understanding from our legal department. And then we can adopt this program. Other municipalities, Prescott Valley's adopted it. I think Chino Valley adopted it. So it isn't a very difficult process. I think we need to move it up and get that done as soon as possible because it is just a simple process. Matt, I don't know if did you know about the MOU?
No.
Okay.
We'll look into it. Joe may know about it. But if it's an MOU process, that's fairly straightforward for us to kind of go through the document and sign on.
But you can direct staff to do that.
Well, they can't, but it's something that council needs to, yeah. So, with respect. Yeah, so the county, we have been in contact with them. I think what we're waiting on is just pulling the trigger and making sure this is where we want to go. I know we want to review the packages to make sure we have a few local amendments that are different from the county. But for single family, I don't anticipate that there's going to be a lot. And now that we finally have our chief building official on board, that's going to be something that he can work with the county on and getting those plans. I know in a prior conversation with Mayor Pro Tem that the county is also going to be revising them for the code update, which is going to be adopted probably first of the year next year. So needing to have those plans updated to accommodate for the code change will be important. But you're absolutely right. This is low-hanging fruit, and all we need to do is really get the direction to pull the trigger and start working with incorporating that, advertising it with some sort of program, which we can definitely come up with. But it seems to be like a good thing. We can move forward quickly.
Thanks, Chelsea. Is it possible to add it to the agenda in terms of the next meeting, just to provide a brief update on where we're at?
Yes, Chair.
I didn't know we got a new building official. I hadn't heard. Would it be appropriate to invite him to one of our meetings so we could meet him and chat a little bit so he kind of gets where we're coming from or not?
I'd say worst case scenario, he says no.
Yeah, I think this is day 9 of him being on site. But yeah, of course, he can come and shake your hand and meet you face to face. His name is Doug Stawarski. So yeah, we can have him come to maybe the March meeting. I don't want to take too much of the time that the committee needs to do their work, but obviously we can have him come and maybe stay after and circulate with you.
Well, I just think a lot of things that we discussed, the building official is going to weigh in on. So, you know.
A lot like the density bonus and zoning things wouldn't be his bailiwick, but for sure the Home in My Own program and pre-approved plans he can speak to. Mm-hmm.
Just a note too, you may want to go online, Randy, you probably have already, and look at the program and look at the projects. Be pretty well versed on it because they're actually, they're very simple. They're very affordable in many cases. But it'd be good for you all to see that if you haven't already.
Connie, I was just looking at it recently before our town forum, and I couldn't find the language any longer that said the cost savings that's affiliated with this program. So I don't know if anybody knows where to find that information.
I think that's a sliding scale depending upon the architect services. So, a good set of plans maybe with a 3,000 square foot home on there can run anywhere from 7 to 15,000, depending upon the complexity. But remember, the Home of Your Own program is a complete the complete building documents. But if anybody decides to actually use it, they will have to provide a site plan with the project oriented on their particular lot. But that's, again, not a big complicated thing. It is a little bit of a cost, but if you're talking about a minimum of $7,000 to $15,000 savings from hiring an architect to start from, ground zero, it is a big savings, really. And don't forget about the time element.
Okay, on this one, Luther has some comments as well. For the priority for infill projects, he suggested it be phrased, the city will prioritize all housing projects located on vacant, underdeveloped, or underutilized sites within the city's existing urban areas by encouraging the reuse of lands and buildings. So the first change is just changing workforce to all. And then he goes down to these projects and changes it to workforce projects will be given expedited permitting processes and consideration for additional development incentives. By allowing all projects on infill, it creates more supply, thus lowering costs to consumer, all things being equal. So I don't know how everybody feels about changing workforce to all, these to workforce, and adding in the by allowing all projects on infill section.
I guess I get where he's coming from, but I feel like we're getting out of our lane if we're talking about all projects. I don't know.
I'm always leery of the word all and never.
And again, we can leave things as is right now, and then when he's at the next meeting, he can maybe speak to it a bit more. All right. Anybody have anything else on the rest of this section? Funding. And these are just, I think most of these came from this committee's discussions of how the city can help with funding, looking for grant funding, being a pass-through program, trust fund, private partnership. So these are all things that this committee's discussed.
Yeah, I had nothing in this section at all.
And just out of a concern when you said going to change the wills to May. Okay, good. These wills are all good because they don't commit the city to anything other than pursuing it and being proactive, which is a good thing.
I will leave these alone.
Thank you.
Matt, section 4 would kind of be your bailiwick anyway, wouldn't it? Because it involves donations, all kinds of different funding things. Sort of a legal deal.
Yeah, we'll be looking at this closely. I think in terms of kind of setting up your policy, I think these are fine as general kind of statements. But once we get into the meat and potatoes of it, there'll be documents that are drawn boilerplate kind of things. So, yep.
Okay, on real property, to keep it specific that the city will continue to look at properties we own, look at our inventory, prioritizing community needs, disposition, and public-private partnerships. So this just encourages that the city will continue to look at avenues in that realm as well. And then there's a section on private property and where the city could assess or could assist, look at the incentives, partnership opportunities.
I read this. I have no comment on any of it. I thought it was okay.
Well, not to touch a, a subject right now, but we might want to wait and see what happens with council in the next few weeks. We may not have any real property that's available for any workforce housing.
So yesterday's meeting is on YouTube and Facebook if anybody wants to watch it. And then I always encourage people to watch council meetings. They're very interesting, educational. Yeah. But they're always recorded. So I'm assuming what you're referring to is yesterday's meeting. So you can always look at YouTube if you want to refer back and see what's going on in the city council realm.
Yeah, so what was floated is a total of 40 parcels? Or 30?
Yeah, and I think the focus is on city-owned and zoned natural area open space or designated on the land use map as open space. So those parcels that could be used for other purposes were not included. I mean, the city owns, lots that are very developable in a neighborhood, and I don't think those were the focus of the conversation. It was more of the natural area open space and those lands used as open space within the city.
Right.
But
correct.
again, the city doesn't have a lot of land to begin with. There's the parcels that we discussed a few meetings ago, and we might have a few others here and there that could work within this section of the policy.
All right. So just saying, mostly the city will keep in mind that we'll work together wherever we can in appropriate manners. All right, implementation monitoring. Luther had one comment on this. To attempt to use current staff, hiring more could create more of a burden on the financial system in the city and more lost work time for the project. So that was his comment on that section.
Is that not applicable to the efforts that we have for a liaison that we're looking to hire for the permanent position?
So, and we'll give an update on the RFP in our updates in 5 minutes. No pressure. So we are getting a consulting firm based off of council's recommendation. So we don't have a full-time position. It's going to be a consulting firm to get through the requirements of the grant of the housing plan and the implementation plan. So this tried to be flexible to be what we need it to be, but we can make it more flexible to say dedicated staff. But dedicated staff could be staff liaison, could be consulting firm, kind of whatever the dedicated staff needs to be. Which then kind of goes into what the designated staff would be responsible for, like program coordination, developer stakeholder support, monitoring and reporting.
I had nothing on this part too. I thought it was well written.
Luther did put, and you touched on this a little bit, Chelsea, about the chief building official, but for monitoring and reporting, he redlined the whole paragraph and put this can be done by the building inspector and not add staff to create more cost to the city and more time burden to the project. Which designated staff per code tends to be vague on whoever council or the department needs it to be.
I would say let's not rush through that revision, and we'll table that one when he's here too, because if he can have some compelling points to back it.
What did you say? I can't read. I'm sorry.
I said we should explore having Luther explain his compelling points behind those statements.
Yeah, and I don't anticipate the chief building official being responsible for that. That's something we'll have to work through and figure out who's going to, if there is a development agreement in play, who's going to be making sure that the project is meeting any timelines or any goals of that nature. I'm sure it'll be someone, obviously, but I wouldn't put that burden all on the chief building official with his other duties.
Which I think in a lot of our codes and policies, it just says designated staff to leave that open. So that's why we use that verbiage, because it seemed pretty consistent with the rest of our codes that just designated city staff or designated staff.
Yeah, and so my silence isn't misconstrued. I still think we need a full-time workforce housing person that works here that is designated for these very things. If we're going to get something done, we need somebody working full-time on it.
I second that motion.
So, Chair, are you okay with us taking a pause there, going through the rest of the updates that we have for today, and then we can continue that, and I'll bring back the edits at the next meeting?
Yeah, sounds good. And I guess we also want to be helpful to you. So do we want to, I know we've all read through this, but we should definitely read through it again and then send you those digital updates so that you're not having to translate. Is that the request?
That would be great. Yeah, if I could get either your red line versions, it can be even an ugly email, just something in documentation I have to continually refer back to and do updates. And then I can also say, if a month from now, because a lot's going to happen between now and then, if you guys ask me who suggested that, I have my notes, but I might not actually remember. So if I have it actually written, it's helpful. But I do have the notes from today I'll incorporate, and we'll go from there.
And those edits will be in red line form so we can see the edit itself.
Yes.
Thank you.
Amber, would you mind giving us just a quick update on the grant?
Yes, that's actually up next. So a couple updates. I will have to talk to our city clerk about whether a vice chair needs to be, I'm assuming a vice chair will need to be picked at the next meeting. We did extend the recruitment for the positions because we hadn't had quite enough people apply for the open positions we're normally going to have. So that actually might work to fill the now additional empty vacancy we have. So we will work on that likely next meeting. We'll pick a new vice chair. And then for the grant, the company that we had, Elliott Pollock and Company, they are doing the housing needs assessment as we speak. We'll try to get an update from them. Michael, who had to leave, he's been the main liaison with them. But they were at the forum and everything like that. We are finishing up looking at the RFPs we received for the consulting firm. We should let you know by the next meeting of who that will be. That consulting firm's role will be to take the housing needs assessment, create a housing plan and a housing implementation plan that will go based off of the guidance of council that will be based off the policy. So council will get the policy, they'll see what's in the policy and what council's feedback is, use that to create a cohesive plan. So we'll have information for you on that one at the next meeting of who that consulting firm will be. So I don't think we have any super goal updates right now. We kind of went through these on Thursday. So I did want to give you guys some information from the forum. We had 49 people who actually signed in, but I feel like we had more in the room. 34 people online. I do know some of those people watched it in groups. So I think the courier said about 100. I like that number, so we're going to go with that. I just put in the results we had from the questions. Not going to go too deep into this. It's in your PowerPoint that you have printed out, but this was the word thing from the first one, which I thought was nice. Availability or price of housing was listed as the first biggest barrier. So you have those. different solutions. We asked of what people thought would be good solutions. The nice thing is there's only one dot that kind of went into that no solution needed realm. So again, these are bigger in your packet, but these are all solutions that people suggested. Some of them are things you're already looking at. Some are things we can't do. Lots of fears. So we'll work through those. It was a 4.9 out of 5 on the importance scale for those attending. These are all the questions if you wanted to look through them, and we can keep them in mind as you continue to go through the policy. So lots of questions. One takeaway tonight I thought was overall positive, encouraging gratitude, working together, community. All right, so I think that is all I have. I thought it was a great turnout. It was really fun.
Amber, you did an awesome job with all of this. And I do want to comment because I had several people come up to me after the forum and share how much they appreciated the Mentimeter format and that it really encouraged a lot more participation, particularly those that don't feel comfortable coming up to the podium or maybe time doesn't permit in a meeting. So several of them actually said, perhaps you could suggest that as a tool to be used at council meetings. So I'll pass that along.
So that'll be something I can pass along to the clerk. They have a lot of laws and rules, so I don't know if that would fit into their laws and rules, but I'll pass that along and we can look and see what Sarah thinks.
And I want to just say before we stop for the day that, I'm a task-oriented guy. I think you guys all know that. And it really feels good to see us actually doing something as a committee, all those meetings and all that time spent. And I'm excited about this because I really feel like we're putting something together. So congrats to everybody here. And you, Connie, thanks.
Take your time, do it right.
Well, thanks everyone for your participation today. It's noon and meeting is adjourned.